Today I'm going to be talking about the folly of continual and perpetual foreign intervention. I will be talking, at least briefly, about the Brussels bomb attacks, which took place about a week ago. But truth be told, I was going to make this video anyway. That is, a video about foreign interventionism, specifically American foreign interventionism and European to a lesser degree. Now, before I proceed, let me first concede that every idea proposed here is one that will almost certainly not be accepted by the political ruling class and also not be implemented. There should be no illusion here that what I'm talking about actually has real-world application, at least pragmatically. Nobody, even if they agree in a superficial way, nobody could implement what I'm talking about. However, the purpose of this video is much more along the lines of providing evidence to show why foreign interventionism is folly. And I liken it to a drug addict returning again and again to get his hit. But let's start the discussion. I'm often accused of not taking into account in previous discussions of the Middle East and Islam, what have you, the phenomenon of blowback. And I always find that quite funny because I've been familiar with blowback for quite some time. The very first time I encountered it is when I read a book by the late political economist Chalmers Johnson entitled Blowback. Surprise, surprise. Now, the first printed expression of this word, blowback, I believe came up in 1953, associated with the violent overthrow and CIA-backed overthrow of Mohammad Mossadegh in Iran. And I'll be talking more about that. I will be making distinctions between different kinds of blowback. But for now, let me just use the general understanding of what blowback is according to the late Chalmers Johnson, an expert. Quote, "In blowback, I set out to explain why we are hated around the world. The concept blowback does not just mean retaliation for things our government has done to and in foreign countries. It refers to retaliation for the numerous illegal operations we have carried out abroad that were kept totally secret from the American public. This means that when the retaliation comes, as it did so spectacularly on September 11th, 2001, the American public is unable to put the events in context, so they tend to support acts intended to lash out against the perpetrators, thereby most commonly preparing the ground for yet another cycle of blowback. In the first book in this trilogy," and this is my own note, he had written 3, that is, Blowback, The Sorrows of Empire, and Nemesis. In the first book in this trilogy, I tried to provide some of the historical background for understanding the dilemmas we as a nation confront today, although I focus more on Asia, the area of my academic training, than on the Middle East." End quote. So that's Chalmers Johnson. And I think this is a reasonably accurate description of what blowback is, but I think it lacks nuance. So, getting to the issue of the Middle East, we're often told that the entirety of our problems in the West are simply due, it's all due, rather, to foreign interventionism and to blowback. And I think when we're trying to understand the phenomenon of blowback and why foreign interventionism is such a bad idea, we need to distinguish between something that is causative and associative. So I'm going to compare 2 different situations. One in South America and one in Iran and in the Middle East. So technically, Iran is not part of the Middle East. So many people are unfamiliar with what's referred to as the first 9/11. The first 9/11 has largely been overshadowed by events of the American 9/11, that is September 11th, 2001. But for people born in Chile, familiar with the history, for those Chileans who had lived through the experience, September 11th, 1973 was probably far worse. Now, for those who don't know, September 11th, 1973 was the date on which the elected president of Chile, Salvador Allende, was assassinated in a military coup by one Pinochet, who then was a dictator for quite some time afterwards. I believe 15 years off the top of my head. Now, this didn't come out of a vacuum. There was American intervention here and support for the coup. Now, my understanding of what happened was that Allende wanted to nationalize, I believe, the telecommunications company there, which had vested moneyed interests, corporate interests in the United States, and this was a large contributing factor. But generally speaking, the perception of his policies being socialist and supposedly supporting communism, I think that's kind of hard one to swallow, official communism at least, led to American intervention. Possibly CIA intervention, although the CIA actually denies direct involvement in this, but nonetheless American intervention. Essentially, he was assassinated in a very violent military coup. Many people were put into effectively concentration camps. At the very least, several thousand people were immediately killed and executed, others sentenced to hard labor. And it created a downward spiral that ruined Chile for the better part of 2 decades. Now, to the best of my knowledge, the West, that is, United States, Canada, Europe, etc., has never experienced a type of September 11, 2001 blowback event from Chile. But what have we experienced, or rather what has occurred in Chile and the greater area of South America as a result of numerous American interventions there, CIA-backed or otherwise, all in the name of either combating communism, that is containment, or in the secretive name of supporting vested, moneyed corporate interests and undermining local governments. What has happened? So we did actually see blowback in Chile and other places like Venezuela, Brazil, and other places in South America, not in the form of violent retaliation against the United States or its allies, but in perception and a reversal of policies that were implemented under many of these dictators' regimes. Specifically, the kind of blowback we see, and I'm expanding the definition of blowback here to an abstract, is opposition to the perception of the implementation of neoliberal economic and political policies. Which is to say, under Augusto Pinochet, there was a heavy involvement of the Chicago School. Milton Friedman was bosom buddies with Pinochet. He denied it to his death, and the implementation of the Chicago School of Thought regarding economics and neoliberal policies, not to be confused with actual libertarian policies. And the perception that these policies contributed, apart from the obvious and overt violence perpetrated by Pinochet and those serving him, to the downfall of Chilean society and the destruction of Chilean society. And this perception is widespread and widely held in South America. Ask any informed person who hails from South America or is familiar with it. And opposition to neoliberal economic and political principles and policies has fueled opposition to what they perceive, many South Americans, as capitalism. It's more likely corporatism, but in general, the perception of neoliberal policies and politics. Now, this is a different kind of blowback to my mind, in my interpretation. This is a kind of social blowback, whereby you have not the entire continent, but large swaths of South America thinking, look what these fucking Americans did to us. Rather, look what the policies they helped to enact did to us. We're going to go in the opposite direction. We're going to nationalize, we're going to socialize, etc. So this is a kind of blowback, but it's not the kind of blowback you see. And once again, blowback, to my mind, is associative. It's not causative. It's not that American interventionism in South America, the policies of containment, directly cause people to laud socialist economic policies, or even Marxism, which was fairly commonplace up until recently. It was associative and, of course, contributive. It contributed to it. But once again, it's whatever ideology itself is present that is latched onto. I want to make that distinction between, because it's very important in the Middle East, I believe, causative versus associative. But once again, in South America, we see a blowback of a different sort. It's a society-wide, maybe civilizational blowback, and it refers mostly to direct politics and economics. What don't we see with regards to South American and indeed Central American blowback, the banana republics, the various juntas that took place there? Somewhat separate issue, but we don't see suicide terrorism. We don't see people running around screaming, Allah Akbar, or as I like to say, Allah's snack bar. No, we don't see that. And why? Because blowback is associative and not causative. So, what do we associate with blowback in South America? We associate the hostile opposition to neoliberal economic and political policies, nominally to the perception of capitalism, etc., etc. Had there not been any American intervention, maybe things might have gone a different way. It's impossible to say, but certainly there are contributing factors here. It's undeniable. But we don't see the reaction in South Americans that we see in certain Middle Easterners. And we have to ask ourselves, why? So moving across the globe to the ancient state of Iran, formerly known as Persia, a long time ago, we saw actually not a too dissimilar type of intervention. Mohammad Mossadegh was not a communist, but he wanted to nationalize Iranian oil. And Anglo-American Oil Company at the time said, that's not a good idea. That's going to be bad for business. They appealed to Dwight Eisenhower, and CIA coup happened. Mossadegh is gotten rid of, to put it nicely, and the Shah is put into place until tensions grow really, really strong and things get really bad, and then you end up with the Iranian Revolution, the taking of the hostages, which Jimmy Carter is regarded as having handled quite poorly. And we see the current Islamic Iran we see today. Mossadegh was not an Islamic fanatic. He was fairly secular, and it's speculation on my part and others, but it is widely thought that had there not been a CIA intervention, Iran could have gone down the path of complete secularization, possibly. Something that would have absolutely been unique in the Middle East. There's not a single country in the Middle East that is particularly secular. No, Israel is not secular. It's a separate story, but yeah. But in response to that, we see a different kind of associative blowback. We saw the Ayatollah Khamenei, the rise of these people who are intimately associated with Islam. Different response. Now, you can also just look at wider Middle Eastern interventions, and we see a similar phenomenon. The source of retaliatory action is not to be found in the intervention itself. That's just associative. Because, as many people have proposed, can you imagine the Quakers or the Amish if you were to do these things? Would they violently take up arms? Probably not. Would they blow themselves up? Almost certainly not. You don't see, I can think of one instance in the entirety of decades of history, one instance of Christian suicide terrorism. suicide terrorism is not uniquely Islamic. You see it in the Tamil Tigers, who have their own weird metaphysics, but you have the source of the retaliatory action to be found in the Quran and the religion of Islam, which is why you see something completely different in South America, different context, different circumstances. I don't think blowback is universally a physical, violent thing. Likewise, in the late 60s and the late 70s, there was an American intervention in Greece. The Greek colonels, incredibly cruel dictators, they're only in power for a few years, but we didn't witness any blowback of that sort there. But these are reasons, nonetheless, to not be involved in all of the world outside of the jurisdiction of our own countries, which is to say the government shouldn't be. Foreign interventionism wreaks havoc upon the countries that they're intervened in. Look at Chile, look at Argentina, look at Central America, look at Iran, look at all these places. And it garners the West, particularly the United States, unnecessary problems. I'm not going to say hatred, but problems. I don't think it's necessary, furthermore, to get involved in these places. Now, before I proceed as to why I don't think it's necessary, many times people will make a case for moral, ethical intervention, that, maybe we shouldn't get involved politically. In fact, I have an Australian friend with an incredible talent for very creative and extremely hypothetical scenarios that he himself has no answer to, mind you. And he was making the case not too long ago for, well, maybe not political interventions, such as the sort where we get rid of Salvador Allende, but we should certainly get involved in moral cases. But let me briefly return to my video, The Ethics of Convenient Interest. And one of the principles I cited as a driving force for being, quote-unquote, ethically concerned is proximity and therefore visibility. Now hold on to proximity and visibility for a bit, because I'm going to be comparing the information we have on two different, quote-unquote, genocides that had gone on in the 90s with very different levels of intervention. One case in the 1990s in the former Yugoslavia, the so-called Bosnian genocide, where various Bosnian Muslims, and I'm butchering the pronunciation, but the Bosniak, the Bosnian Muslims, were killed, as well as the expulsion of many other citizens from that area. And something that happened in Rwanda in Africa. Now, this is referred to as a genocide. The actual numbers, however, are not terribly impressive, not if you really want to do sort of point-by-point comparison. So officially, to my knowledge, based on what I've read, the death toll for those murdered was around 8,373, give or take, maybe 8,500, and several tens of thousands of non-fatal injuries. But the United States got involved in the Balkan conflict. And I'm oversimplifying things. Obviously, this is an immensely complicated thing with the politics, and that would be beyond the scope of this video. I'm more interested in talking about American intervention here. And there are all kinds of reasons for this. But before we turn to American intervention and why the United States intervened in the Balkans, why don't we talk about the other genocide that went on in Africa? Now, if you go on a point-by-point basis, the Rwandan genocide blows not only the Bosnian genocide out of the water, I mean, by sheer numbers, but pretty much anything you can think of. I mean, people think of the millions of people murdered during World War II by the Nazi mechanized Nazi modern war machine, that's nothing. So depending on how you look at it, something between 500,000 and a million Rwandans were killed. Some people, the general consensus is about 800,000. Oh, that doesn't sound very impressive, but it all took place within 100 days from about April 7th to sometime during I think July 1994. So about 100 days. And they did it rather expeditiously by means of knives, machetes, sharp objects, blunt objects. They didn't have trains, tanks, well-organized military units. It was chaos. And basically, probably the worst genocide we have on record, just in terms of efficiency and brutality. Fairly modern, 1994. Many of us remember it. I remember it. I was around. Many of you were around as well. And basically it was a Tutsi, this tribe, as well as some moderate Hutus, as conflicting tribes that didn't necessarily agree with what was going on with the Hutu majority government. Very effective, very expeditious mass murder, genocide, people killing each other. The United States didn't get involved. Now, if you were to use my Australian friend's argument, then the United States absolutely should have gotten involved, right? Moral obligation and all that. We need to prevent the deaths. And we're talking about a fraction of the percentage in the Bosnian conflict of people who died there compared to the Rwandan genocide. I mean, to be honest, I'm going to be honest. Maybe I'll offend some people. I don't really care. But if you want to, in terms of the stats and the brutality, what happened in the Balkans just doesn't compare to Rwanda. Why did we not get involved in Rwanda? That is, we, the West, Western governments, specifically the United States and some other allied powers, but did get involved in the former Yugoslavia? Well, the answer is actually pretty obvious. If you look at the former Yugoslavia, the Balkan Peninsula, number one, simply it's more visible, right? Proximity. And if you know the history a bit, the Balkans have been geopolitically relevant and fairly important for well over a century. I mean, I'm not just talking about, and I'm butchering his name, Gavrilo Princip, the Black Hand assassin, the Bosnian assassin who killed the Austro-Hungarian Archduke Ferdinand, and thus precipitating World War I. Obviously not the only cause, but simplified. Since before that, a gateway to the West, right, on the cusp of Europe, southeastern Europe. So there's a degree of importance there. Anything that happens there could spill out potentially to the rest of Europe. And there are all kinds of kooky theories, such as Clinton trying to cover up his whole Monica Lewinsky scandal. Let's not talk about those. But look at Rwanda. Probably the most brutal modern genocide period. I would argue, in terms of brutality and just insanity, far worse than anything happened in World War II. We didn't get involved. Well, why not? I'll tell you why we didn't get involved. That is, the West, the governments. And it's not going to be politically correct. It's because Rwanda is an African shithole that nobody gives a shit about. The mass destruction of life in Rwanda had zero consequences, I'd argue, for concerned Europeans and the American government, frankly speaking. I mean, who cares that lots of Tutsi were killed? Who fucking cares? The fact of the matter is that the ethics of convenient interest are always in play when it comes to foreign intervention, even when it's moral. Because the Balkan intervention is often cited post-intervention historically as humanitarian intervention, as distinct from the other interventions we might see, such as in South America, where you have corporate interests, as well as Iran, and to the more sort of political interests we saw in Indonesia, with the genocides committed there, which were assisted by the CIA in providing communications and telecommunications and small firearms. This is something that always is in place. And therefore, practically speaking, there's no real distinction between non-humanitarian intervention and humanitarian intervention. The way it plays out practically is always the same. There needs to be an economic interest, a geopolitical interest, and when there isn't one, it doesn't matter how bad it is. Remember, 100 days, almost 1 million people killed, butchered, raped, men raped, women raped, children raped, machetes, rusty knives, you name it. I mean, far worse than anything we could think of in recent times, and far worse than what happened to the Bosniaks. But we didn't get involved because we don't care. And that's honest. At least it's honest. So I just wanted to establish that at the outset, and this is going to obviously be a rather longish video, but humanitarian intervention versus political intervention, I think my friend there, he's a bit confused. Now, he cited, of course, well, when shit hit the fan in East Timor, and, what happened there, a lot of bad things, Australia got involved. Well, does he honestly think Australia got involved purely for humanitarian reasons? East Timor is right above Australia. Does anyone know what happened during the Vietnam War? The first wave of boat people came to Australia. Vietnamese fleeing from the conflict there. And we all know what Australia's immigration policy is, and it's a very good one, mind you. Keep the boat people out. The perpetuation of conflict and violence in East Timor would have been detrimental to Australians' immigration policy. Australia didn't intervene in East Timor because they were concerned. I mean, nominally they might have named that as a cause or a reason, but it's bullshit. Actual humanitarian interest is almost, I can't think of a single instance where it's actually a real reason if you peel back the curtains and say, well, geopolitically. Look, destruction of East Timor, of East Timorian life, would have been detrimental to Australia. It would have gotten more refugees. It would have affected immigration. It would have put more stress on the system. It was in Australia's geopolitical interests to intervene there. And I hope my friend realizes that. My creative friend with his hypothetical creative scenarios. So let's first get that out of the way. Intervention is practically, if you can observe it, almost never based on some sort of moral principle. It's sometimes couched in that language, but ultimately it rarely is. Sometimes it's not at all. I mean, there are dozens of cases during the 20th century of CIA and U.S. government interventions that have just nothing. I mean, I suppose containing communism is cited as a moral imperative, but we all know that's bullshit. Communism died more or less on its own. We didn't need to get involved in Vietnam and all these other places. But moving on to the modern state of affairs, as in 2016, late March. Well, we are involved still, the West, the United States, the UK, in the Middle East specifically. The Middle East is a hotbed of a lot of bullshit. And oftentimes it's cited mostly by far-left lunatics and Muslim apologists who tend to be Muslim themselves. It's all the West's fault. It's all the United States' fault. And like I said, associative, contributive factors, absolutely. Causative, I think not. But even in all the chaos, I think we should not be involved now. We've had over a century of Western involvement in the Middle East. The creation of Iraq, the creation of the State of Israel, all of this crap that has created non-stop conflict and problems for the West. And frankly speaking, I don't think it's any of our business. We who are Western, we who are European and American. The Middle East is the Middle East, and Europe and the United States are themselves. Whatever happens in the Middle East isn't really relevant to us. Now, increasingly, it seems that way. Migration crisis, immigrant crisis, economic migrant crisis, all of this stuff. But I think it's largely an illusion. Where we do need intervention is domestically. Robust interventionism. We need to shore up the borders. We need to annul the Schengen Agreement, at least temporarily, until this crisis is contained. We don't need more involvement in the Middle East. Now, I'll be linking to this, but Sam Harris did a podcast with one, I believe his name is Michael Weiss. Both of them are robust interventionists. Sam Harris is a statist and an interventionist. I like a lot of his stuff, but some of the stuff I don't. And this journalist he interviewed has been sort of tracking ISIS for 3 to 5 years. And listening to it, you just get a sense of just how enormously complex and complicated the issue is. It's just... And I thought it was fascinating that at the end, both of them interventionists, and particularly the journalist himself, who works for the Henry Jackson Society in London, which is a sort of neoconservative platform, that he sort of shrugs his shoulders towards the end of the interview and says, well, maybe a couple of years ago I would have known what to do, but in an act of philosophical aporia, to use the term, he says, I just don't know anymore. And this is the answer we have. We don't know what to do anymore. There is a state of ISIS, an Islamic state. And our answer is to get continually involved, perpetual intervention forever. And as I said at the outset, I liken this to a drug addict. The guy who keeps on going back for his kick, for his hit, because he just can't fucking put the crack pipe down. Now, people have cited, and I think it's true by now, that if we were to withdraw from the Middle East, that is the West, the United States and Europe, leave them to their devices, we still would experience associative blowback, events, and I'll get to Brussels in a bit, such as Brussels and Paris and what have you. But just as a drug addict tries to get off his crack pipe or his heroin needle, there will be withdrawal symptoms. It's just not in Western interest to be involved in every cross. I mean, this doesn't just count the Middle East. This counts everything. I'm talking about the everywhere. South Korea, North Korea. I mean, Japan. Let them sort it out themselves. But specifically in the Middle East. Now, it's often argued that there are interests there. There's specifically two powers, political entities there that wield an enormous influence in the United States. One of them is Israel, the other is Saudi Arabia. They wield enormous influence for two very different reasons, and I plan on making a separate video on the poison of lobbying. I think lobbying as a principle is incredibly poisonous and toxic and noxious, and it ruins the Republican state of affairs one could potentially have in the United States and elsewhere. But I want to talk about in a separate video. But needless to say, Saudi Arabia traditionally has held for decades a lot of influence in the United States because of oil. But increasingly, there are new options for oil, fracking. We are, I think, as I speak, less and less dependent on Saudi oil. I mean, yes, OPEC and what have you, they can push for an artificial perception of dependence, but I think we're moving away from that. And as for Israel, moneyed Jewish interests, basically bribing and paying off government officials. I mean, Israel itself isn't particularly natural resource rich. And at least with the Saudi Arabians, the claim, nobody pretends that there's some great thing going on there. It's always been about the oil, right? That's why we kiss the royal family's ass. We, the West, the government. In the case of Israel, it's mostly a PR campaign. So we support Israel because democracy. Now, I think it's actually arguable, and I don't want to go too much into this in this video, that Israel's a democracy. After all, it is an ethno-supremacist state where it's defined as a Jewish state, and the requirement for Israel to be whole and sound is that there is a majority of Jews. There must be a majority of Jews as a primary absolute. This doesn't seem particularly democratic to me, but hey, that's just my view. But yes, democracy. Well, who cares? Then they say, well, Israel is economically productive. Yeah, it's pretty productive. There's some smart people there. They do some research. We trade stuff with them, tech mostly. So what? We don't need to be involved. We don't need to give them $3 billion a year. We also don't need to give the Egyptians money. I give them about $2 billion, I think. But for lobbying, and lobbying is a great poison. If we, the West, that is Europe and the United States, were to leave the Middle East, I actually think we would see more positives than negatives. And let me tell you why. When people are left to their own devices, they're forced to either cooperate or not. At the end of the day, you have a choice between conversation and violent conflict. But the West, and particularly the United States, mollycoddles the Middle East, intervenes, gives financial, military support. Let's say there were no American hand, no British hand, no European hand there anymore. Israel was left to its own devices. And let me explain my position. I think I've talked about. I'm not really against Israel. I'm not for it. I think the creation of Israel was a mistake, but we're stuck with it. But then again, I don't care what they do. They want to create a wall with Palestinians or whatever, they can do it. And if they want to kill each other, they can do it. I don't care. If Israel disappeared tomorrow, I wouldn't care. And I wouldn't really care if the rest of the Middle East disappeared, including Saudi Arabia and Kuwait and all the rest of them. I just don't care, frankly speaking. Proximity, visibility, and also because I'm tired of the arguments that I hear that are largely artificial, that Middle Eastern interests are the same as American and European. They're not. They're artificial, and most of it's due to lobbying. But if Israel and, say, Saudi Arabia and Iran were all forced to do their own thing, there obviously would be two outcomes. One, they would be forced, for the sake of peaceful coexistence, to somehow coexist, cooperate, and maybe even start trading. And trade leads to better relations, at the very least, and possibly friendship, although I think friendship is more or less excluded here. But they could do that. Or they could just fight each other. Either way, doesn't really affect the West. Not really. I mean, yeah, there'd be some oil issues. Like I said, increasingly there are other options for oil. Now, there are other options for the West as well. We leave them alone. Look at how much the Sunni and Shia Muslims hate each other. They could slaughter each other. They did it for centuries. Right? It wouldn't be our problem, and they would be distracted. So maybe, there could be a Shia-Sunni conflict. I mean, ISIS is largely Sunni. All of that geopolitically, since I'm not using moralistic terms here, this humanitarian bullshit, and it's never in play anyway, would be useful for the West, and we don't need to get involved. The Sunnis and Shias hate each other. Saudi Arabia hates Iran. So maybe the Israel and Saudis could team up against Iran, Iran and various minorities in Iraq. I mean, who cares? But it doesn't affect us in the West, not really. And as long as we shore up the borders in Europe, right? As long as we keep out the hordes and get tighter and better security going, it's not really our concern. I've never heard a convincing argument for the humanitarian or even really geopolitical intervention in the Middle East. As I said, with the Saudis, it's just, nobody lies. It's, we need your oil, right? With Israel, it's a bunch of propaganda and con artistry and artificial moneyed interests going to the system. But we just don't need to be involved in any of these countries. The Middle East is not Europe, and it's certainly not the United States. So, lobbying is a separate issue. I want to cover that to a greater extent in another video. But I think I've made the case here that they would either have to cooperate or not. But either way, the West would remain largely unaffected. And if they did cooperate, maybe we could have better trading relations with them. All for trade, not for violent intervention. But this is related, of course, to some of the events, recent events in Brussels. I think that the death toll is about 33 or 34. Various bombs went off, one in an airport, the other in a metro. And this is I'm becoming fairly sanguine about all of it. And I'll tell you why. There's a sort of ennui that's been setting in the back of my mind. It used to be exciting, wow, Muslim terrorism in Europe, but now it's just sort of, as the Germans would say, gang und gäbe, just, it's happening all the time. Or every couple of months, a bunch of Muslims blow themselves up and kill a bunch of people. A couple of dozen, maybe 100 plus. That's just, the way it is. It's kind of normalized by now. and the responses are normalized as well. What's unfortunate every time there's Muslim terrorism is that we respond by even more intervention, like the drug addict, right? We need to get involved even more. That's the gut reaction. And I think here's where the money here, with the public just sort of supports the sort of lashing out. And ISIS loves it. I think the worst thing we could do to ISIS would just be to ignore them. They want the attention. They're lavish. They're lavished in attention. They like the publicity. They have a very sophisticated PR campaign going. And listen to the interview. We can just mind our own business here. Shore up. I mean, we need to deport people, obviously. We need to profile Muslims, obviously. We need to, frankly speaking, start getting rid of people. And I think the only peaceful way of doing this is paying people to leave. And I want to talk about that in a separate video, but frankly, this is more about interventionism. There's a lot of stuff we can do at home that is in Europe and the United States, but we don't need to get further involved in the Middle East. That's their business. Let the Israelis and the Saudis and the Iranians and all the rest of the powers that be there fight it out or cooperate. If they all kill each other, good. The West has less of a problem to worry about. If they don't, we can trade with them, also beneficial. But with regards to Brussels, I mean, the idea that, this was actually a retaliatory action for what happened in Paris. So nabbing the terrorists in Paris led apparently to a retaliatory action in Brussels. Because I'm just saying that before the usual Muslim apologists pipe in and say, look, it's clearly for this Muslim terrorist attack was clearly based on Belgian influence in Congo and Belgian expansionism and colonialism in Congo, obviously, because so many Congolese were involved. Oh, wait, there weren't. Sorry about that. No. It's always the same thing. A bunch of Muslims piping up saying, oh, this has nothing to do with Islam, blah, 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 until the next bombing, and then you get more and more of it. Look, Islam can do a fantastic job of fucking things up and bombing without any intervention. The idea that the West ruined some sort of Islamic progressive state of affairs is lunacy. Actually, why don't we just listen to a bit of a recent podcast Sam Harris had where he articulates it far better than I potentially could, at least here. Let's have a listen.
But this appeal to a Muslim golden age, or a time where the doctrine of jihad was just meant an inner spiritual struggle, that is largely fictional. And I think we are now living through a time where a politically correct pseudo-history is being put forward as something that exonerates religion, and Islam in particular, in the role it's played in inspiring tribalism and conflict. A few thoughts on the notion of a Muslim golden age. I always find it telling when someone is arguing about how important Islamic civilization has been to the career of our species, that preserving the work of Aristotle always appears somewhere near the top of the list. I mean, just think about that for a second. Aristotle was great, don't get me wrong, but he's a single non-Muslim philosopher. And he wasn't perfect, right? I mean, he said many things that impeded the progress of science. I think his importance for future generations was primarily as a counterpoint to 1,000 years of Abrahamic religious craziness that practically ruined human history. And I count Christianity as the main offender here. Yes, it is true to say that a millennium ago, the Muslim world was ahead of the Christian West. But that doesn't say anything good about Islam. It's just a reminder of how terrible Christianity was. And as for the ultimate significance of Islamic civilization, yes, there were Muslims making advances in optics. I think Omer said this somewhere in his article, and one often hears this, but they weren't using these advances to build telescopes and understand the cosmos. They were using them to design religious calendars and more accurately pinpoint the direction of Mecca. Here's the basic fact that the Muslim community just has to grapple with. There are single zip codes in New York and Massachusetts that have produced more of enduring value scientifically, artistically, ethically, politically, than the entire Muslim world has produced in 1,000 years. And if you think that claim is inaccurate, or that it contains a shred of bigotry, you are lying to yourself. Most of you have heard me mention the UN Arab Human Development Report, which revealed that the country of Spain translates more of the world's literature and learning into Spanish each year than the entire Arab world has translated into Arabic since the 9th century. And we're talking about Spain, which is not leading the world intellectually at the moment. Arabs, of course, are only 5% of the world population, but they produce only 1% of the world's books, and a higher percentage of those are religious than anywhere else. Again, that's just the Arab world, but do you really think that adding Indonesia and Malaysia and Iran to the list would suddenly make Islamic culture look as creative as Western culture?
It's quite telling, isn't it, that Spain, which has never been an intellectual powerhouse, seems to be just a true bibliophile as a country compared to just basically any Arab country. Countries with far more resources economically due to oil and thus far more opportunities. But I guess the question you need to ask is, well, so for the past 1,000 years, did the United States impede the Muslim world from engaging in learning and scientific advancement? Was it Henry II? I mean, come on. At this point in time, nobody on the ground outside of the mainstream political spectrum really buys the idea that Islam is a religion of peace or Islam is this great boon upon society. Islam is a blight upon human civilization. Whatever little good it has done has been far outweighed by the harm it has done. And as Sam Harris points out and others, no one is on the receiving end of Islamic harm more than Muslims. This is the great irony. And of course, in chime the apologists all the time. But yeah, I mean, this is just going to continue going on and on and on. This is going to be normalized European events. Brussels, maybe it'll be Berlin next time. Maybe it'll be Madrid, Rome. Who knows? Just every couple of months, more Muslim terrorism, and we're all bullshit. We express solidarity and blah 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 blah. No, enough is enough. Obviously, we need to crack down at home as domestically. We need a robust interventionism domestically, and we need to leave these lunatics to their own devices. And yes, I count Israel among the lunatics. So let them do whatever they want. Let them kill each other. Let them cooperate. It's none of our business. It's none of our business. And I think I have adduced evidence to show that historically, practically, even when we claim to intervene for the reasons of humanitarianism, it's never really about humanitarianism. So that's pretty much my perspective on this. There's not much else to say. I think I share a lot of people's sentiments that Muslim terrorism and terror attacks are just incredibly boring. I mean, it's boring to talk about. It's repetitive, and you have to say the same thing over and over and over again. But there you have it. I pretty much said my piece on this matter. I don't think we should be involved. I think we should work on our own countries and foster better relations with people who are similar. I mean, I often think Canada and the United States have not really strained relations, but we're far too estranged from each other. We have a estranged relationship. We don't really communicate. Particularly Americans don't know very much about Canada. And yet we're so similar in a lot of ways. Beautiful landscape in Canada. And why don't we foster relations and robust trade and maybe even free travel between the two countries there, rather than focusing on shitholes in the Middle East. I mean, the Middle East the Euphrates might have been the cradle and the birthplace of civilization, but now it's pretty much the end of it. And that's all I have to say on the matter. Thanks for listening. More to come. A bit slow this month, but should pick up next month, and I'll see you all later. Bye-bye.